Good morning from my time zone, afternoon from Bristol, UK. We have a virtually connecting session from OER 18. And why don't I start with a quick introduction of our virtual folks that are here with us. I'll let Fiona start, then go with Helen, and then we'll go on site to do introductions from there.
Okay. Hi, I'm Fiona Harvey, and I'm the Head of Digital Education at the University College of Estate Management in Reading, UK. I've got a background in digital literacy and badges and e-portfolios, so that's what I'm interested in, and students.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Fiona. Similar background. I'm Helen DeWard. I teach at Faculty of Education here in Central Ontario with a focus on digital and media literacies.
Wonderful.
And I'm Ken Bauer, computer science professor here in Tecnológico de Monterrey and Guadalajara campus, and I'll be your virtual buddy for this session. And why don't we go back to the on-site and let us know what's going on there. I was trying to follow the conversation of the keynote this morning. It was a little earlier for me to actually grok what was going on, but why don't you let us know what's going on there?
Yeah, shall we introduce ourselves as well?
Yeah, sure.
Cool. You go ahead, Richard.
I'm Richard Ullman. I'm currently Senior Systems Developer at the University of Gloucestershire. I recognize some of the names, if not the people here, because I think a lot of you will have seen me on the Moodle forums and Twitter and various other places. So nice to see some faces and put some faces to names that I know.
My name is Doug Belshaw. As of January, I am also involved in Moodle. I'm working for Moodle HQ. I'm leading a new MoodleNet project. I'm also a consultant and have a co-op. And before that, I was on the Open Badges team and on web literacy. And I wrote my thesis on digital literacies. And I think I know everyone here, and it's good to meet Richard in person.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. So there was a lot of buzz this morning. Did you want to talk about the keynote that was going on or something else later this morning?
Well, it's interesting. What did you pick up on? Because there were loads and loads of tweets going through. Was there anything which you picked up in particular? Because it seemed to me that Lorna was doing a great job of giving kind of a history. She said that she'd been to every single every OER 8 conference since OER 10, the first one.
Wow.
And that was interesting for me because that's when I joined JISC. I moved out of the classroom teaching and going to work for JISC, and Lorna was a colleague of mine. I didn't realize that was the first one, but she did a great job, I thought, of giving an overview of each one.
Yeah, the buzz I was getting is we talk about the problems that open solves, and so people were saying, well, what about sometimes we need closed? That there's a discussion for people that don't feel comfortable being out in the open, and we had some of this discussion going on in the fishbowl this morning, and I know Helen was there. I was just quickly watching it, and so people were asking, but so sometimes open isn't the solution. And if closed is the solution, what's the question?
Right.
Yeah, I think one of the big areas and one of the reasons that's come up now in particular is all the stuff that's going on with data privacy, isn't it? Right. And Facebook is the prime example. It's a closed source software, but we still have issues with data and what's happening to it. Is open the solution to that? Who knows? There are situations where I think stuff does have to be kept private. One example I can think of from the university I used to work in before Gloucestershire, there's no way we could have put all of our stuff with our psychology students as open because they're talking to clients. You just can't make that open data without some kind of anonymization process to go with it. On the other hand, my feeling is there's a limited amount that needs to be closed, and you can open most things, even if it does need a bit of sort of processing in advance to do something like anonymizing it and hiding some of that data.
I think there's a couple of distinctions to be made, and it was interesting to see how Catherine Cronin's talk built on what Lorna had been saying. I don't know if they kind of collaborated beforehand and knew what each other they were going to say. But, in my experience, there's a difference between transparency and openness. And I'm both a privacy advocate and an open advocate, and I don't see any tension between the two. I feel like transparency, the way that I conceptualize it, is transparency within your organization. And that's different from working openly across different organizations, for example. Catherine was talking in her talk about open digital practices and being less and more open. And she gave 4 different facets of that. She talked about identity, networking, tools, and the use of OER. But interestingly, she also talked about how open is both a descriptive and an aspirational term. And I actually gave a keynote 5 years ago at this conference, and I was talking about productive and unproductive uses of ambiguity, and how you can have something which is productively ambiguous in the sense that it gives you wiggle room to be able to do interesting work. What you don't want is something which has a definite meaning and there's no wiggle room, but equally you don't want something which is unproductively ambiguous so that people can just use it for anything. So I think we've all seen for-profit capitalist companies open wash stuff. And that's certainly not what we want either. So it's a complicated terrain, I think, and that's certainly something that Catherine talked about as well in her talk, in her presentation.
I'm sorry I missed the beginning of that. My machine dropped out, which is great. But I just wanted to say, one of the things I think is really, really important is to let people know what it actually means, because we assume because we know stuff, but I've come into a different environment now where they're not as aware of privacy issues, or they believe that when Cambridge Analytica comes up, that means everything has to be shut down. Like, that's it. That's the end of us having access to anything.
That's why you disconnect it, Fiona.
Exactly. Yeah, just unplug. And I think it's that kind of the misguided view, or the belief that they watch something on TV, or Fox News comes out with something, or the Daily Mail, and that's it. And it's that lack of knowledge which cuts them off from actually having access to a world of information and resources. If I start talking about OER now, I don't know, someone might go, well, where's that come from? If we use that, does that mean they'll capture all our data? And the GDPR thing too. It's like, okay, that's it. Get rid of every email you've ever had your whole life, and you can't.
I think that's a really important point. I was listening to a podcast this morning. It's called Hurry Slowly. It's a fantastic podcast about kind of pacing yourself and doing your best work. And the interviewer was talking to someone who was a designer who had a long career designing, and she was talking about a particular situation where she saw one of her colleagues explaining serif and sans serif typefaces to a client, and she was laughing at this, saying, "Oh, why are you doing that? That's like the most basic thing ever." And then realizing that actually there's a level of legibility of the work that's been doing. And I think we all do work around kind of literacies, but literacies has kind of power structures embedded. Whereas I think legibility, like making your project legible so that people who don't have your level of technical or pedagogical expertise can even access what it is you're talking about. And I feel like we need to do that around open practices as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's true.
Conversations around choice and awareness, agency in terms of students and institutional use of open. Is there, Catherine or Lorna mention anything along that line?
What do you think, Richard?
Not that I picked up on particularly. There were conversations around what Doug was just saying in the though, and the use of language when we're talking about open and both open education resources and open education practice, and when we're talking to people and trying to get people from outside the OER community involved, the kind of language that we use when we're talking to other people, it's the same point you're just making. They don't have, or don't always have, the same understanding of what open actually means. And what does open mean? It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to all of us within the community, let alone when we're talking to academics, non-academics, anybody else that might have an interest. And I mean,
it's more of an attitude than a particular thing.
Exactly.
It's an attitude or a stance rather than anything else. Lorna was talking about the value proposition for OER in the US being kind of open textbooks and saving money, that kind of thing. Whereas in the UK, it's more about kind of civic mission and civic society, which I thought was an interesting kind of juxtaposition. And also, I remember Catherine in the question and answer session after her presentation was talking about an example from her PhD research where an educator had been encouraged to go on Twitter with their students, and there'd been some kind of, I think she talked about context collapse and how people had come in and jumped in and made some kind of witty or satirical or teasing kind of remarks, and the academic kind of then retreated back out of the open space because they weren't, although they kind of dealt with it, they weren't willing to kind of do that again. And so it's equipping people to be able to deal with that too. One of my colleagues at Mozilla, who's now part of our co-op, Laura Hilliger, we were doing some work yesterday with a client, and it was really interesting because she's a woman in tech, and she's kind of developed such a thick skin that she laughs at kind of YouTube comments and Twitter stuff and like, oh, really? You're really going to kind of reenact that trope or that cliche or whatever? Like, she's so strong in being able to do that. But it's how do you scaffold people to kind of get to that stage? Because people might say, well, I don't want to develop a thick skin. I just want to kind of do my job.
Right. And I think there's a common thread there of a lot that have been working in the how do we get people into this space and prepare them for that? That when this happens, especially to my students, I mean, they might get trolled, and I need to prepare them before it happens and not after it happens, because they might not even tell me. Making that responsible work to guide people and hold their hands going into an open space, I think, is really critical.
No, definitely. I think one of the things I would suggest in this sense is this is why it's really important to own, you know, we've talked about domain of one's own and owning your own data and that kind of thing. And that's why it's particularly important here. So, for example, if you're on a platform where you don't get the choice of whether to delete that troll's comment or block them or whatever, versus, hey, you're talking in my space. Audrey Waters, for example, hasn't had comments on her blog for the last 5 years at least, because you know, she wasn't prepared to have those misogynistic comments, etc. And to the extent that she doesn't even allow a hypothesis as an annotation layer on her blog as well. And those are the decisions you can make when you own your own domain and your own space. And that's why I think it's really important to induct staff and students into being able to have the skills to be able to do those things, because it's not just reappropriating tools that, you know, beneficent large corporations who have some kind of shareholder value bestow upon us.
Beneficent in I think a lot of us here are from not just the open education resources community, but involved in open source software as well. And I think that's another direction that this can go. And there was a couple of us chatting on Twitter earlier about the overlap between OER and open source and how those two can benefit each other. Because just picking up on what Doug has said there, you've just got to compare at one certain microblogging platform that I've just mentioned with something like Mastodon and an open source platform. And if you don't like the way that's going, you can set your own up, or you can tweak it and you can make it do whatever you want in terms of holding data, not holding data, allowing people to delete things, because you can just customize the instance that you set up. So I think that distributed platform as well is another way to go with this in terms of open. You can be open in terms of what you're sharing on a public platform, then public maybe rather than open. You sometimes lose control of that openness. So it is choosing your platform, and how you manage that platform is an important part of choosing to be open. And sometimes not frightening the people that you're talking to about openness. You want to share this, your students want it on Facebook, Twitter, wherever. I'm not going anywhere near Facebook, thank you very much. Okay, so what other alternatives can we give you to be able to share, to be able to put it open, to make it a little bit more public without opening some of those risks as well?
Do you think people just don't appreciate the benefits that they get from doing that? You know, so like if they just hear the fearful, horrible thing, but they don't get the good things. They don't see what the good things are because they never get to experience it. They're just afraid all the time, and they don't have the skills to control in the way that we were talking.
I'm sure we all went through this 20 years ago. I know I did when the internet was first growing in schools, and it was, we shouldn't put the internet into classrooms because look at all these nasty things that they might be able to see on there. And then, of course, solutions come round. I mean, you get blockers and whitelist, blacklist, and children-friendly search engines. I come from a primary school background, by the way. So
really,
yeah.
But there's lots of there's one of my pet hates is when people try and have a purely technical solution to what is a social or pedagogical problem.
Yeah.
And often we look at things in that way. And I was just thinking it might be interesting to go around in terms of, if you can think back in terms of your first foray into kind of openness, connecting with people online. I've got a theory that people are, there's always somebody who's introduced you, someone who's kind of held your hand, rather than you just tweeting into the void or doing whatever. There's always somebody who's inducted. It's a bit like volunteering. I'm on the committee of my local scouts, and we're thinking about kind of architectures of participation. How do you get volunteers through the door? How do you get people? And it's not just saying, oh, abstractly, you should do this thing. It's giving them something to do and saying why that's a valuable thing for the organization, for the person, or whatever. And yeah, I kind of got inducted as a history teacher and kind of followed things through. But I'm interested in what other people have done as well.
Well, if I pick up on that, my introduction to sort of online social media forums environments was actually Moodle. I was a primary school teacher. I'd been an advisory teacher. I was going back in as a deputy head, needing to set up a website for the school. Opted, because we'd used it in the county, to use Moodle, and then thought, this is a brand new school, I better learn how to brand and color and put logo on, and started asking questions in the forums on Moodle. And after a couple of months, realized I could start answering other people's questions as much as asking my own. And that was before I ever started using anything like Twitter, probably before Twitter was even around. So yeah, Moodle was, and the online forums was my introduction to the sort of social space online.
Yes, forums too as well. What about?
So what you're talking about is that constant negotiation that we need to do with ourselves, making those decisions, but with the people that we're bringing into the spaces as well. So kind of saying, okay, take this little step and try this little thing, and then, but organizationally, we want to see things change. How do we make that happen without all the little footsteps?
And also being patient about it, Helen. And we saw this with our own community where Terry tweeted out, "Thank you, Ken, for your video about how to do virtually buddying." And I held Nate's hand a little bit on the weekend with his first session of this, is that we need that buddy. I remember Adam, who helped me in 1988 connect to my first BBS. And so it was a little longer ago. But I think it's important to hold people's hands and let them know what's going to happen and let them discover. I remember saying, my colleagues say, "Oh, I don't have time for Twitter." And I backhandedly say, I don't have time to not have Twitter because it makes me so much more efficient. And Alec Koros pointed out, but Ken, you've curated a community over a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time to get this benefit out of these tools.
That's completely right. When I first went online, it was because I was doing a higher national certificate in business information technology as a woman returner, because I just I designed a website as part of that, and that was the thing I loved. I wasn't happy with the C++ or whatever I had to do, but I gave it a go. I now know I don't have any logic. That's fine, but I loved the website stuff. And then I went home and I bought a computer, and it was a massive, great big thing. But then I was going, look, you can go on chat forums and talk to people anywhere. So I remember going into one and someone was asking about the Matrix, and I was like, I haven't even seen it. I don't know. And they was like, oh, and it was like, but it was all, it's text. It wasn't anything. That's how old I am. But it was from doing that, I got the confidence, but it was having the knowledge about, I needed to know what happened behind the scenes. That's how I got my confidence. And I knew I wouldn't break it. And I knew I could just do anything. I'm not going to take the internet down if I do something wrong.
There was a really interesting point just on that, Fiona, because I was thinking as you were saying that the early days of Twitter, just like with anything, any community, anything like that, the early days of Twitter were very different from how things are now that everyone's on board and all that kind of stuff, and it's all about branding yourself and stuff.
Yeah.
And you mentioned Mastodon before. I'm using social.coop, so I'm a co-owner of the instance that I'm on, and just how different the interactions are there compared to Twitter, for example. And in Catherine's talk, she was talking about, let me see, she was saying how it's almost not fair that we get to jump on things early, develop our network, and then use our privilege to say, oh, well, now I've got my network and everyone else, I'm going to bring those into like a share, like a private space, like Slack or whatever, and have my conversations there. And now we're getting students to like forcing them into a space which is much more public than we had when we were making our first steps.
Yeah, that's true.
I thought that was a really good point to be made.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is good. Yeah, I love the tie to open source software as well, because I'm a software engineer, and I see the parallels and still what's happening now with the problems with Cambridge Analytica and everything else happening is there's been a lot of push to be more open, and the Creative Commons community saying only use CC BY, don't put more restrictions on your license. But then I see a lot of people saying, yeah, but I want to release my stuff, but I don't want bad people to use it, right? And so how do I share, but only share to the people I want to share? But it just doesn't work that way. So this has created a bit of confusion in our community, I think, as well.
And I think the different licenses do have value. I know that Brian Mathers, who I think most of you will know, and who's part of our co-op, he releases most of his work under a no derivatives license, because he doesn't want people kind of chopping his images up into different bits and just taking parts of it, which is entirely reasonable. And I know that, I don't know if this is still the case, but Joss Wynn at Lincoln University, who's a huge open advocate, he would always release things under CC BY SA, share alike, because he wanted to make sure that the people who were then getting the resource had to then share things under the same kind of license. Having a co-op, there's interestingly an open co-op license, which means that unless you're a co-op, you don't have access, like open access to the resource, but you can reuse it freely if you're a cooperative. So it's thinking about institutional ownership there as well. The problem I always have with this kind of stuff, and the reason why I share most of my stuff as CC0 or public domain, is that I haven't got time to chase any of that up. I've already moved on by the time they're using it, and who's going to enforce all this, to be fair?
Right. And well, maybe it's not just enforcing, but I think tying it back to software engineering and open source is there's the Gpl versus Bsd, whereas Gpl is the viral license, where if you use my stuff and you add stuff, you got to share your stuff. And that's kind of like CC BY SA. And that tends to be why I do SA, because I kind of want to convince people that don't just use free stuff, be a contributor. And so that's kind of the message I'm trying to send when I'm using SA.
And that was a big topic of conversation at the Creative Commons Summit this time around, is that if you want to use the stuff, be part of the community that's creating the stuff. A big conversation around Wikimedia and Wikipedia being used by YouTube to promote their understanding, and you know how wrong that is, because they don't contribute to that open community.
I want to be wary of your time as well on site. Doug and Richard, are you fine?
Yeah, the next session. What? Yeah. However long is necessary.
We usually set up half an hour, but I always like to make sure I'm being conscious of people's time, especially on site.
So are you both presenting? Are you both presenting at the conference?
No, I have the luxury of not presenting. I was at the Moodle Moot a couple of weeks ago, and I was the MC. I presented and ran a workshop, but I just collapsed afterwards.
Been there, done that a few years ago. I just presented this week, but I had to leave early. Just picking up on what we've been saying about CC licensing, though, it's interesting stroke worrying this new proposal from somebody in the EU about the copyright law, and almost forcing people to take payment for use of their materials, which some people are suggesting will cause some issues for the Creative Commons license.
It was talked about at the Creative Commons Summit.
big business benefit rather than, I guess most of us who use Creative Commons tend not to be those big businesses, apart from a few of the sort of newspapers who've started licensing materials as Creative Commons. But yeah, it'll be interesting to follow that discussion as it happens or doesn't in the end.
Good. Anything else folks want to add, or are we winding down?
I wondered whether people want to talk about badges at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Fiona's eyes lit up. All right.
Let's go there.
Teresa's here as well. There we go. You might need to move on.
Right, well,
There's Teresa.
hello.
Yay. Hi, Teresa.
Thank you much for your help over the last few days getting my virtually connecting bits and bobs done, despite hotel Wi-Fi and issues that I've had.
And here's an example of someone who gets pushed off into the deep end and just comes up swimming.
We keep going.
And she gets a badge. She gets a badge for
Oh,
that.
yes.
Is there a badge for that? That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll have to see what Doug can do for us.
Yeah.
A while back, Fiona organised an Open Badges HE, or
Oh, yeah.
was going on a conference that Doug presented at and many others came to. And yeah, I want to know what's going on with Open Badges and where are we going next? We're certainly still using them.
Well, so I've just started this new job at UCEM, which is fantastic because they're just all over badges and they're all over open and they're all over portfolios, and it's just be disruptive. Fiona was like, yay, exactly what you wish for. Which is lovely, but they've really got on board with the badges because they see the benefits to the students, and the students, some students at different levels use it for different things. So level 3, for example, so that's like, because we've got Ofsted and we've got the QAA, so there's two different balances, but badges are doing really well with apprenticeships. So the students are really excited and they can see the benefits. And as long as I'm trying to push this idea about your online identity and like that, the purpose of all of this is to make you manage your online presence as opposed to randomly letting stuff happen. So we're tying it with portfolios, which is really lovely. And then I'm using them for CPD here. I've just started to develop some for the learning technologists here. I've just been poor. I feel so sorry for them because I'm like, look what you can do. And there's 8 I'm doing milestone badges, and then they get their overall one, and I've mapped it to UKPSF, and I've done everything I possibly can to help them. And we're starting to do that from May. So I'm very excited about that.
Good.
Excellent. Excellent. I recently did a workshop for a colleague in Turkey, and we had about 100 trainee language teachers online in a webinar, and we were talking about use of video for language teaching. And having sort of, gone through a little bit about Creative Commons licensing and sharing and repurposing, I set them a challenge, which was to create a little Flipgrid video and then share it back. And I said, and then you can use that as evidence and apply for a badge, the Open Education Practitioner badge. And 25 came in over the next few days.
Oh,
and I was really impressed with them because they stuck at it. I mean, nothing was explained in Turkish. Everything was explained in English.
Oh,
Like that.
It's that resilience, isn't it? Again, we were talking about resilience earlier, and I think that's that kind of, it has benefits, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. They picked up on the tips around, it doesn't have to be you if you don't want to record yourself. So we had teddy bears talking and people putting, remixes of videos together. It was fascinating. And it's good to see them enthused about it because they want to be practitioners in what sometimes is a pretty shitty job. I wouldn't be going back 30 years on. I wouldn't be going back into teaching now. It's hard, and it's relentless. And if they've got enthusiasm and they've got an avenue for their creativity, they've got a chance of making it through 30 years.
Indeed. You asked about I'm just wary of time, and just you asked about the kind of current state and future of badges. And so I thought, just quickly, off the top of my head, things which are happening at the moment in the badges world. Quick plug for the stuff that our co-op kind of curates for the community. So first of all, badge.news, badge news. That goes out every month now, and we have some very kind sponsors who are through the badge platforms, and that'll keep you up to date with some of the stuff that's happening within the kind of open digital credential world. And then there's a wiki, badge.wiki is the address, and that's a place that we've had some funding to do some work around. And Grania Hamilton, who some of you will know, did some great work around writing up some of the work from the Mozilla Discover Pathways project, because I felt that didn't have enough. It was all over the place, all over the web. She did a great job of pulling everything together into a page. So if you go to Badge Wiki and search for Badge Pathways, there's a whole lot of stuff on there which you might find useful. Just to catch people up, as you'll know, from the 1st of January 2017, IMS Global Learning Consortium took over the stewardship of open badges. There was a bit of a interesting controversy last year where Pearson kind of made a claim around having some kind of invention of open badges or some kind of patent. Interestingly, last week they announced that Credly is now basically acquired Pearson claim. And given that Credly white labels their platform to City and Guilds Digital Me, there's pretty much a cornering of some part of the open badges market going on there. Badger, which is an open source platform, they are just about to launch their Pathways tool, which is great, and I've had a preview of that. The W3C, so for those of you who don't know, the World Wide Web Consortium, they look after standards, which is why we can do this kind of hangout in any modern web browser. They have got a verifiable claims working group. And the really interesting work that's going on there with people like Kerry Lamoy and Nate Otto and some of the familiar names is that at the moment, and Fiona, I think you've come across this, and Teresa, you as well, you've got organizations who want to share potentially credentials and work across the piece. And at the moment, those assertions are owned by the institution, owned by a particular issuer. And I think the verifiable claims working group, which open badges would adhere to in the same way that BlockCerts adheres to the open badges specification, there is going to be a situation where you can have peer issuing, and it's kind of complicated from a technical point of view, but it basically means, and I wish he'd be able to explain a lot better. It's kind of taking it out of their hands. Originally, open badges was supposed to be this massively emancipatory kind of thing, and it's kind of been co-opted by the man. But the idea is that it kind of puts things back into, but it keeps badges weird and puts things back into the hands of the community.
Cool. Yeah. Excellent. That's great.
Wonderful.
You.
Where would you be without these fonts of knowledge? In a forum somewhere reading.
Too many notes to follow up on now. I'm busily
well,
scribbling.
Just to say that I think the open badges, the way that that's developed, if you've been following that over the last 7 years or so, has been a really interesting example of how to do community stuff and then how not to do community stuff as well. Because the community around open badges is, it's kind of undead, I would say. Like it's still there in terms of the Google groups, and there's still people like having conversations like this, but there's no real common hub for that. And I'd love to do some work kind of reinvigorating that. But it obviously needs to be funded work, given all of our times and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I have to say the barn raising idea that Doug launched was just brilliant. I so enjoyed that. It was yet another opportunity for me to spend time I haven't really got doing something I probably should be doing. I enjoyed it. And just the fellowship of putting stuff together and being trusted to make our contributions, even if they're imperfect, in my case, contributions, you think, okay, well, I've done my bit, and you know, I've been a little part of something much bigger. And you know, having those sort of inspirational moments is what keeps us all going.
Yeah.
I think it's similar to sprint events where you just pull people in, have them start building and creating. So I think, you know, it's a different concept with a same concept with a different name attached to it. So barn raising, I love from the,
And I totally stole that from Wikipedia, who do, you know, Wikipedia barn raisings and stuff like that. I think it goes back full circle to the discussion around Creative Commons licenses and about when you're an open practitioner, attribution is really important. I remember Alan Levine talking about using CC0 license photographs, but still attributing even though he didn't need to.
Right.
And it being about identity tied to production, and the central part of being an open educator is producing and not just consuming stuff. So I'd like to see that more with the world of badges as well.
Right. That's one of Alan's classic posts of at least just say thank you. Because that's what our mom taught us.
Exactly. It's a counter narrative to the exploitation of industrialization and just being worker ants and nobody cares who you are, you're just a number. It's so important that it brings us back to the humanity of production.
And that kind of comes what I was thinking about this morning, about how people take small steps to get into this community. And there's different things we can do. Maybe we like using open resources. Maybe you're not yet creating any yet, but at least you can say thank you, a la Alan's message of,
Absolutely.
you have the right to use my CC0 stuff without giving me credit, but just give me credit. Right? And I like that. I love what you're talking about as well, Teresa, how kind of the magic of touching technology for the first time as well, or getting people to create things. And I really love that. And when Doug was bringing up the point about our first touch, or maybe it was Richard, of touching technology and the online, I remember that magic. And Fiona, her eyes were lighting up about the text chat. And those are magic times when you're touching these communities for the first time. And we perhaps get a bit jaded or forget about those magic moments.
I think we're going to have to move out because people are starting to come in for their stuff.
Thanks for the photo you posted there, Teresa. The room looks better that way.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Doug. Thank you, Richard.
Lovely.
Thank you, Helen, for joining us today. And I'll hit the stop broadcast button and I'll let us sign out then.
Lovely. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.